couple days ago, I read or finished reading Greenvoe by George Mackay Brown. This is the third novel this year that I've read by George Mackay Brown, and I recently also bought um, a book of his poetry, his collected poems, all the poems he ever wrote. Um, because I think he was more known for his poetry, but I've up to this point I've only been reading his novels. He's got some short story collections too. But anyways, this is the third novel of his that I've read this year. Um, and it's I think the only novel of his that's in a contemporary setting. Mostly he wrote historical novels about the past of Orkney, the Orkney Islands, the archipelago off the north coast of Scotland, where he lived his whole life. Um, and I think his short stories are kind of a mixture, some historical, some contemporary, but this is his only novel in a contemporary setting. So it was written in like the mid to late 1960s, and it's set in um I think because I remember there's a point later in the book where it mentions a fire that happened in, I want to say, 1965, and then I had to flip back to the start of a book because there's a character who mentions like, oh, there was a fire in my house 3 years ago, so that would mean it's set in 1968, I think, if I remember correctly. But yeah, anyways, came out in 1972. Um, so this is set in a fictional town, a fictional small town on a fictional island within the real archipelago of the Orkney Islands, where George McKay Brown was born and where he lived pretty much his whole life. He lived in on the mainland of Scotland for a couple years while he was attending the University of Edinburgh. And then I think he only left Orkney one other time aside from the university, and it was a vacation to Ireland, in like his 20s or 30s or something. And other than that, he never left Orkney. So all of his books are set in Orkney. They're all very interested in the landscape and also the people of the Orkney Islands. Um, and like I've never been there. Definitely going to go there. I want to do a family trip to Scotland someday, and I'll make sure to do a day trip to Orkney while we're in Scotland. Because my favorite author's from there. My favorite whiskey is also from there, Highland Park. But yeah. So his work is very specific to the Orkney Islands, but I think he's a great example of how a good writer can find the universal within the particular. Um, because although his work is like hyper specific to the Orkney Islands, his characters are very realistic, very relatable, and his there's a lot of insight about the human experience and human nature within his characters. So this one is kind of just following the lives of an assortment of characters in this fictional small town. And it's interesting if you read the back of the book or if you look up a synopsis of this book online, it's going to say like, "Oh, this is a book about." Well, how does it even phrase it on here? Yeah, so the second sentence of the synopsis on the back of this book is a sinister military industrial project, Operation Black Star, requires the island for unspecified purposes and threatens the islanders' way of life. That doesn't happen till the last chapter. Like, all the way up to this is a 240-page book. You don't know anything about this government project thing until what is it? Like that's page 207 of a 242-page book is when you find out about Operation Black Star. Um, so that's not really what the book is about, for the bulk of it anyways, but that's like the thing that all the synopses sort of focus on. It's a book about these people and their lives and what small town life in the Orkney Islands is like, and all these different people from different sort of segments of society within this small town. There's a school teacher, there's a couple different fishermen who have very different personalities and sort of occupy very different archetypes, despite the fact that they're both fishermen. Um, there's a preacher who's an alcoholic. There's his mother who blames herself for him being an alcoholic, and like she has these I don't know if it's quite hallucinations. I don't know if she thinks they're real, but she has these like daydreams of herself being put on trial for making her son an alcoholic, and then we get flashbacks about her life on the mainland before they moved. Her son became the the priest for this island. There's this woman who has a son from like every man on the island. She's got like seven kids from seven different fathers, and an eighth one is born during the course of the book. Um, and she's a delightful character. She's just this very kind, sweet woman. Um, and then there's like the guy who runs the general store and his wife. Um, so there's just all these different characters from different segments of society, and you're getting to know them. You're viewing the way that they interact with each other and their relationships and what their lives are like on the island. And then suddenly in the last chapter, those last 35 pages or whatever, this government project takes over the island. They all get their houses bought, and either sent to a different island or sent to the mainland. Um, and you just watch as this small town like very abruptly disappears in the course of like 6 months. Uh, and sorry, I think I was a little sick earlier this week, so my breathing's a little weird right now. But oh, and I forgot one of the most fun characters is the Scarf, which so his last name is Scarf, but the way that they nobody calls him by his first name, they just call him the Scarf, and I looked up this word because I figured it was probably a word that means something. Um, it's a word in both Norse and in Gaelic. It was borrowed into Gaelic from Norse, that means a cormorant. And there's actually a scene towards the end of the book where he sees a cormorant on the beach and they have a little moment. But anyways, he's also a fisherman. There's three fisherman characters. He's the third one. But he never goes out fishing. His boat just kind of sits in the harbor in a state of partial disrepair. And he's a Marxist and also an amateur historian, and he's writing a history of the islands. And there's some excerpts throughout the book of his history that he's writing of this fictional island. Um, so I like him. He's a fun character. Uh, Sorry, what was I saying before I remembered about the scarf? Yeah. So it's just it really it's a book about small town life in Orkney. But then right at the end of the book, it abruptly the town disappears because of the government project. But the book's not really mostly about that project, so I don't know. It's weird to me that all the synopses focus on that. Yeah, so yeah, and like it says in this, his first novel, George Mackay Brown recreates a week in the life of the island community as they come to terms with the destructiveness of Operation Black Star. No, that's not true. That's not what happens in this book. They don't know about Operation Black Star until like it's already underway and their houses are being bought. Like the book is not about them coming to terms with it. Um, and the first five chapters, I guess, are about a week in the life of the island, but then chapter six takes place over the course of like a year, basically. Um, yeah, I don't know. I really like this. I do want to read some of George McKay Brown's short story collections to get a little more of him writing in a contemporary setting. Because this was I had read two of his historical novels before this, but I liked his work on contemporary Orkney as well. Uh, and I think there are some of his short stories are in a contemporary setting. So I'm going to check out some of those. I'm going to continue reading his poetry. I've also got a couple more of his historical novels on my shelf that I'm going to be doing in 2026 at some point. Um, oh, and then one other interesting thing that's happening in this book, um, at the end of each chapter, we get a brief scene depicting this sort of occult initiation ceremony. Um, almost like a Freemason thing or like a Golden Dawn type thing, but all of the titles and the names and the elements of the ritual are relating to like agriculture or fishing or life on a rural island. Um, and then right at the end of the book, you find out who it is that's doing these occult ceremonies. So that was an interesting thing. I'm not totally sure on the meaning of that. I'd probably have to think about it a little longer and maybe reread the book. Especially now that I know which characters are doing that stuff, because you only get their titles within the ritual. You don't get their real names of who it is until the end of the book. Uh, but yeah, I did really like this. I think I rated it 5 stars. Continuing to really enjoy George McKay Brown. Like I said, I've started reading his poetry as well, which I think is what he was more famous for. And I'm liking that. I want to read more poetry in 2026. I've never been super into poetry in the past, but I think I'm starting to get it. I'm starting to understand how to read poetry and what to appreciate about it. So yeah, that's what's going on. Um, and I do recommend this. It is one of my favorite books I read this year. I made a TikTok with my favorite reads of 2025, and this was in there. Yeah, and I think that's it.